You walk through a pre-war subway station. Although it is rather dirty and crumbling in places, it is far from abandoned. The station is littered with violent thugs who are just itching for a fight. After exploring the subway, reminiscing about the pre-war times with all of the reminders of the little joys of life from pre-war ads, you eventually run into a vault door, similar to the vault that kept you alive all of those years. Curious about what you could see, you open the door, and you find the vault is filled with even more thugs. Concerned as you continue, wondering if you are the only person in all of the vaults to have survived, after making your way through the maze that is the vault, you find a robotic man being held captive. He says to you,
"You gonna talk? Why'd you risk everything to find me? I'm just a private eye."
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we are going to be discussing Nick Valentine. More specifically, is he his own person or is he just an extension of the pre-war cop his personality originates from? To decide this, we will have to discuss several things. Firstly, who was pre-war Nick Valentine? Secondly, we will discuss the Institute experiment, so how the synth came to exist. And finally, who is the Nick Valentine we know today? What does he do, and how is this similar to the person he is based off of? To begin, we should start with the Nick Valentine of pre-war times. Nick Valentine was a pre-war detective. Originally, he worked with the Chicago police. However, he would eventually make the move to Boston to work for the Boston police force. This was in the hopes to track down a notorious criminal by the name of Eddie Winter. There was an entire task force put together for this being known as Operation Winter's End. Now, Eddie Winter was an important player in the Boston crime scene, being part of the Irish crime families in Boston. Winter was a mob boss who had involvement in many crime families and many different types of crime, from robberies to assassinations.
One bullet halfway across town, and you blew Ron Trevillo's head clean off. You, sir, are an artist. Are all the assassins from Russia as good as you?
Now this was not done without leaving a trail of evidence. No, Eddie Winter was far too arrogant for that. Initially, he would record and encrypt holotapes with information about the crime incriminating both himself and others. However, as his confidence would grow, he would become lax and would record these holotapes, leaving them without any form of code to cover his tracks. Now he and his associates figured that the police may have been collecting these tapes as they were literally pieces of evidence to the wider criminal activities throughout Boston, and this would lead to them threatening and attempting to intimidate known members of the task force, one of these being Nick Valentine, who of course was rather new to Boston. Now, Nick did not make the move alone. No, he would actually bring his fiancée, Jennifer Lands, along with him. His fiancée was just a regular civilian, who, apart from being engaged to Nick, had no involvement in the police force. However, her engagement to Nick would lead to Winter and his associates asking around about her. Initially, this would arise no suspicions in the police force, so they would leave her unguarded and unprotected after they decided not to place her in witness protection. However, this decision could be considered rather questionable, as not long after the sniffing around of Winter's thugs, in the August of 2077, Jennifer Lands would be out in South Boston. She would be gunned down in front of the Joe Spucky sandwich shop that Eddie Winter just happened to own. The suspicion for the murder, of course, fell on Eddie Winter, and Nick, heartbroken, would continue working hard to get him, along with his criminal associates, taken off the streets of Boston. Jumping to October of 2077. This is when Nick Valentine's hard work would finally pay off. Well, sort of. This is when Operation Winter's End would draw to a close. But not in the way Nick expected. No, instead, Nick found out he was just a pawn for the police, and the justice he had desired would never be served. We see this with the holotape that Captain Jonathan Widmark would send to Nick Valentine.
I got briefed this afternoon, and they laid it all out. The whole thing. Winter's deal with the DA, his agreement to bring down the other families, his idea to record the holotapes and incriminate all known associates, and them needing a legitimate op and a real task force to make it all look like Winter was the focus. It was the plan all along, Nick. There's nothing we can do. Winter was a stoolie for the feds. He reported directly to the BADTFL, all on the books. For his cooperation, Winter will be granted total immunity.
as the original plan with Winter's End would be to actually offer Eddie Winters immunity, as it was their plan all along to essentially have Eddie Winters testify against his associates, incriminating them in all of their wrongdoing. But with this, Eddie Winter would not spend a day in prison. He would not pay for the pain he caused Nick and so many others. With the dust hardly settling on the realization that he was used, he would be sent by Captain Jonathan Widmark to the Commonwealth's Institute of Technology, or CIT, as they were supposedly doing a study to help with the processing of trauma, this involving brain scans. Not long after these events, we would see the end of the world as human Nick knew it, with the bombs dropping on the 23rd of October 2077. Now we should move on to what exactly allowed Nick Valentine to live on and become the synth we know. Synth Valentine's personality is based on a brain scan from the pre-war era, this being done during the study by the CIT. Now this personality would be downloaded into a prototype synth, which would be one of the two that would bridge the gap between Generation 2 and Generation 3 synths. It would be one of many personalities that was trialed with this prototype synth, but it seems to be the one that stuck best. These synths were most likely created over a century before 2287, so long before Fallout 4 begins. During that time, several events would occur. After the years of Nick Valentine being essentially a toy that the Institute kept to examine, poke and prod, as we all know, in a little cell in the Institute is not where our synth Nick would remain for eternity. No, he would be busted out by a good friend, someone that could perhaps be even considered a brother. This being Dima.
I literally saw myself in you. You were my brother, Nick. I helped you escape the Institute. We left together.
So Nick, after escaping the Institute with Dima, would be set to his factory settings. This being that he was the Nick Valentine of the past. So he had any new memories of his synth life gone, this being part of an Institute failsafe. This would lead to Nick attacking Dima as he would not recognize his brother. Dima, for his own safety, would knock Nick out. Nick, of course, would not remember this, eventually waking up in a pile of trash in Cambridge. As Nick had no post-war memories, these being wiped, after it would cause several confusing weeks as he would wander the wastelands. Nick would eventually find his way to a small town, who would, although meet him with caution, grow to accept the synthetic man, showing him kindness which he had not previously experienced. Eventually, Nick would move on from this small town, again wandering the wastes. This is where he would stumble on a group of 4 thugs and a teenage girl who was rather upset with their company. Nick would rescue the girl from the thugs and would take her back to her home, this being Diamond City. This rescue itself would be rather strange. So the girl would have run away from Diamond City, thinking that her so-called boyfriend was part of a caravan company, but instead he and his friends turned out to be kidnappers, who would hold her hostage until Nick's arrival. Now his saving of her was not through the intense firefight you might expect. Instead, it was actually through some quick thinking and rather cunning behavior. This was through Nick pretending to be a walking explosive device by making beeping noises. He would scare off the thugs and rescue the girl, taking her back to Diamond City. Now Nick's arrival was a little while after a tragic event, the Broken Mask incident, where another synth, this being a Generation 3 synth, killed several people in Diamond City in the central bar. This being not the only event that would cause caution and hatred towards synths. The other event being the massacre of the CPG, this likely occurring in the 2230s, as it would have most likely occurred before the fall of the castle, being the important base of the Minutemen. So the CPG, or the Commonwealth Provisional Government, were a group that would have leaders from various settlements meeting up. This would be sabotaged by a Generation 3 synth going and killing all of the representatives at the talk. This would cause growing unease for future talks, leading to the CPG eventually disbanding in the year 2282. So the people of Diamond City would normally react with a lot more caution towards those who were synths or even potential synths. This even resulting in some potentially being shot on sight when presenting to the Diamond City gates. However, because Nick would not turn up alone, his fate would be rather different. Nick would be accompanied with the girl he rescued, who actually happened to be the daughter of the mayor at the time, Mayor Henry Roberts. Mayor Roberts was incredibly thankful to see his daughter alive and safe, and against the wishes of many of his citizens, he would actually allow Nick into the city. With Nick arriving, he was not greeted with a warm welcome like with the previous town he had made a home in. Instead, he worked hard to prove himself, taking on odd jobs and essentially becoming the handyman of Diamond City, doing whatever those inside did not wish to do. Now that we know how Synth Nick was created and how he got to Diamond City, we should move on to discuss how he became the well-respected detective of Diamond City that we know him to be. So as part of being the only blatantly obvious synth in Diamond City, Nick was often viewed as a neutral party in the various squabbles and problems that the citizens would have. So along with the various handyman tasks, other requests would begin to pour in. People would begin to see him when people went missing or run off. Like that with the case of Darla, the current lover of Skinny Malone, the gangster who currently runs Vault 114. Now Darla is no polite and lost young woman, like her family believes. No, she is an aggressive lady with a violent streak and a thing for bad men. But her family believes she is in danger, so Nick Valentine gets sent off to investigate, which is how you end up finding him trapped in the vault under the guard of some rather aggressive gangsters. After helping him out, he recruits you, the sole survivor, as a sort of sidekick. We would see this with several side quests that Nick would send you on, including his assistance with the Nakano case. This being where the daughter of an old friend would leave the safety of her home and travel to the island of Far Harbor. All this being, of course, without her parents knowing. Now this would not be the only investigation that Nick takes part in during the sole survivor's search for their lost child. Nick, obviously caring about the missing child, does what he can to assist in the investigation, to the point where he helps to find Kellogg, the man who kidnapped your baby. After doing what he could to assist you with your missing family, once he really felt he could trust you, he would ask for your help with his own family issues.
You know, there is this chunk of Nick Valentine history I've been hoping to put a bow on for a while now. I could use a hand if you're willing to take a crack at it.
Sure thing. What's the case?
Well, this one's straight out of the archives. Once upon a time, in the land of Boston, there lived a king of organized crime, Eddie Winter. He was a bad man who did a lot of bad things.
Now Nick, of course, having the pre-war memories, would have knowledge of what happened to his pre-war counterpart's fiancée. Jennifer Lands was of course killed by the thugs of Eddie Winter as a sort of warning, and human Nick never got justice. However, this event occurred more than 200 years in the past, so how do you get revenge or justice against a dead man? Do you dig him up and make him stand trial like what they did to Pope Formosus, who was exhumed and put on trial for his supposed crimes against canon law? Then he had his fingers cut off and was thrown into a river? Talk about an unfair trial. The man couldn't even defend himself. After all, he was very dead. No. Instead, luckily for Nick Valentine, the criminal mastermind did not want to go out with the bombs. Instead, he would participate in an experiment exposing Winter to incredibly dangerous levels of radiation, leaving him as one of the few pre-war ghouls. However, unlike most ghouls, he would not just be waltzing around the wastelands. No, instead he planned to wait out the apocalypse in his very own bunker, which is a questionable decision for several reasons, like where is he getting food? How is he entertaining himself? How is he disposing of waste materials? But anyway, we are not going down the rabbit hole on any of that. So Eddie Winter is sitting in the relative safety of his personal bunker. This protected by a passcode hidden in the encryption spread out over 10 holotapes. Winter thought that there was no way anyone could find him and get into the bunker of his. This obviously being proven wrong.
No way. Not after all this time. Don't tell me you actually cracked my code. In the holotapes? Well, hey, it's only been what? 200 years?
Now we know that Nick would not just be satisfied with seeing the ghoulish appearance of Winter and continuing on with his day, even though Winter had essentially been in a prison of his own creation for the past 200 years, living in the bunker, never setting foot in the outside wastelands, being kept in a self-isolated prison. This would not be enough for our private detective friend. He would still desire revenge for the actions of Eddie Winter, leading to Valentine, of course, killing Winter. So now that we have an idea about Nick Valentine's origins, we can answer the question, is Nick Valentine his own person, Or is he just an extension of the pre-war cop? So for this, we need to define what would make Nick his own person. This being the synthetic Nick being capable of having his own thoughts, feelings, and personality, along with understanding that he is not, in fact, just a copy of the pre-war Nick. To do this, we should first discuss a few tests or experiments. The first being the Turing test. So the Turing test that was proposed in 1950 by the English mathematician Alan M. Turing, purpose of this test was to figure out whether or not a computer would be able to think. This test, now being 75 years old, was originally called the imitation game by Turing. In this test, or game, an interrogator must figure out which of the two subjects it is asking questions is human and which is a computer. This essentially tests a computer's ability to think. However, unless you are asking the questions that are more meaningful or even odd, you are unlikely to stump a computer these days, as certain AI programs can even pass a Turing test. An expansion of the Turing test is the Chinese room experiment or Chinese room argument. This comes from 1981 and is the idea of an American philosopher by the name John Searle. In this experiment, a person who knows no Chinese is locked in a room. This room contains a large amount of books with Chinese language that tell you how to essentially match a question in Chinese to an answer in Chinese, providing the person locked inside the ability to respond to questions submitted through a slot in the door. So, the person inside does not know Chinese and would be unable to understand the questions and the answers. However, they would still pass the Turing test. So, question with this. Does the room know Chinese? Let me know your opinion on that. An interesting thought with this though. If you have ever learned a language in school, what the textbook teaches you is very different to how the language is spoken or used. This is the same for those guidebooks you can pick up. This is also the case based on regions when it comes to slang. An example of this is already present in this video. When talking about Eddie Winter's associates, I use the term thugs. Now this is not a term I would normally use. Instead, I would use a term like goons. But the internet apparently has a different meaning for this. Yeah, I found that out today. So if the person in the Chinese room experiment was replying, then it is likely they would be replying in a very robotic or very formal manner with potential mistakes like writing the wrong symbol. They may also be using outdated language, so it is unlikely that the language would seem natural. Now these tests can be considered rather simple when you think about the complexity of not only the synths but also the human experience. Yes, Nick would be able to pass the Turing test, as not only could he type a reply, but he has the ability to speak and is considered rather intelligent. But is he more than just the pre-war identity he is based on? Well, firstly, Nick Valentine during pre-war times was a detective, and you may consider the private investigator path for the synthetic version as just a way of falling into old habits. However, there is some argument against this. Nick did not initially go seeking this role out. His initial job in Diamond City was a handyman and an odd job type man. So he was doing the work that no one else wanted to do. But no one would forget his heroism with rescuing the former mayor's daughter. Which is why, when people would start to trust him, they would begin to go to him with their problems. He would track down missing people, like the wife who ran away with her lover, and the rent money, or the husband who took the kids to Good Neighbor in the middle of the night. Eventually, because of all of the interest and his skill from the pre-war personality, he would create his business. This was not his initial intent. One could also argue that his handling of Eddie Winter would also be different to his pre-war counterpart. Now, Eddie Winter was more or less in a prison, solitary confinement situation of his own design for over 200 years. He was also severely disfigured, in a experimental sort of torture situation. Yes, he did it to himself. For most people, this situation would drive them mad, having no one to talk to, no change of scenery, and no connection to the outside world. Plus, the condition he had may have been painful or uncomfortable. Some may even consider this more punishment than his criminal associates would have received, as they most likely died with the bombs. Pre-war Nick likely would have seen this as a form of justice in itself, because yes, Winter survived the war, but he was not free. He was in a prison of his own design, unlikely to ever be free. However, Synth Nick desired revenge more than anything else for the actions of Winter. Nick did not see this form of self-imprisonment as punishment enough for Winter's crimes. With the synth version of Nick spending time in the wastelands, he would develop his own sense of justice.
Everything I ever was belonged to Nick. I'd hoped with Winter gone, the last hint of that old world snuffed out, I could finally be free. But being out here with you, what What I finally realized after all this time was that taking down Winter, it wasn't about Nick or Jenny or even you or me. It was about justice, about doing what's right. And that act of goodness, that's ours. All the good we've done, that's ours, and ours alone.
This also hints that he has an idea of himself that is not just based around his pre-war self. Yes, he identifies with the person his personality and being was based on, but he has also evolved past it to create an extension of it. So no, he is not just the pre-war cop. Instead, he is an evolution of the personality he was based on, becoming adapted for the harsh realities of the wasteland and even thriving. So let me know in the comments, do you think Nick Valentine is his own person, or is he just a shell of his pre-war personality? But there is something we have not really discussed about Nick.
You were my brother, Nick. I helped you escape the Institute. We left together.
In this video, we will discuss whether or not Dima, Nick's brother, was a savior for the synths, or was he up to something more sinister?